Good morning, everyone. It's so good to have you here in the house of the Lord. Let me ask you, if you will, to stand out of reverence for the Word of God, and let's read together this theme verse we have adopted for this year. You are good, and you do good. Teach me your statutes. Psalm 119:68. Thank you so much. You may be seated. We're continuing this morning in our series of messages. I've titled The Great Rescue, the Bible and Being Found by God. I'm convinced that that is what the Bible is all about. It's a grand rescue story. And God is seeking to find us and rescue us. So we've been advancing through very quickly through the Bible, and we've reached the period of the exile and return. That's where we are in terms of the story we're told in the Bible. And we talked last week about the agony of the exile, the anguish that accompanied the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the city, the tearing down of the wall, and the demolishing of the temple of Yahweh. And the slaughter of so many, and then the forcible evacuation and being carried off into captivity in Babylon. That's where we left it last week. Today we will move a little bit forward, and I've titled today's message, The Second Temple and the Samaritans, and that's actually a little bit not quite the right term, because they were not called Samaritans at the time we're looking at during the time of Ezra. That's what they end up being calling when we get to the first century and Jesus 500 some odd years later. But I just wanted to make that connection in your minds. The people we're talking about today will 5 centuries later become the people we find in the New Testament described as the Samaritans, the people that live in the northern area. So that's the story we'll be looking at today. Let me introduce this with a personal anecdote, something that happened to me recently. I was at a restaurant with my wife, and I needed to go to the restroom, so I got up and I went into the restroom, and I walk in, and I'm looking for the urinal, and I didn't find it. There were 3 stalls with toilets and no urinal. And of course, I'm walking deep into this bathroom trying to find the urinal, and of course, when I reach the end of it, there's no urinal, and there's somebody sitting in one of the stalls. So I panicked. I went into the last stall and did what I needed to do, and waited for the person next to me to leave, because I was convinced I must have gone into the women's restroom. I don't know how I did that, but so the person eventually left, and I finally finished and left, and turns out I wasn't wrong. It was an honest-to-goodness men's restroom. Now, I told my wife this, and she's like, why would you think that? But I hope guys in here understand what I'm talking about, right? I mean, that is bizarre to walk into a regular old restaurant restroom that has multiple stalls and find not a single urinal. It's very obvious you're supposed to have both. You have to have the urinal, and you have to have the stall with the toilet. What does that have to do with what we're talking about today? I'm going to point out, as we look at this story of the return from the exile, that there's one bit of the story that they get wrong. There's one part that is present, and there's another part that should be present that is not. And I'm going to argue as we look at this text that to be faithful to God, we need to have the full thing, both parts of it. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we work through the text. Let's start. We're in chapter 4 of Ezra. Now, if we look in the previous chapter, let me catch us up with the history, right? We left off with the exile. For hundreds of years, a couple of hundred years, the northern tribes had been unfaithful to Yahweh. Not a single king in the north did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, and they constantly participated in idolatry, and the kings all kind of pushed this very strongly, some extremely strongly, like Ahab, in the north, eventually, God stops protecting them, and the Assyrians come in. They conquer. They carry off almost everyone into exile and scatter them throughout their empire. And then they take scattered peoples from all the nations they've conquered and resettle them in Israel. And that's happened. And then about 200 years later, Judah in the south, also God stops protecting them. And then it's the Babylonians who come in and conquer. And that's what we looked at last week, the fall of Jerusalem, about a couple of hundred years after the northern territories had fallen. And we then arrive 70 years after the fall of Jerusalem. 70 years the people of Israel have been in exile, the people of Judah. And things change. We have a king arise who conquers the Babylonian Empire and conquers the capital city of Babylon and establishes that as the capital of the empire. And that is Cyrus the Great of Persia. And suddenly the Babylonians become the Medo-Persian Empire. And Cyrus comes into power with a very different approach than the Babylonians. It isn't just about conquering and taking control of foreign nations, but he wants to have allegiance from the conquered nations. So he tries to be much more benevolent. And he writes an edict and says, all the people in Judah, people of Judah who are in Babylon and that area, who want to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple to Yahweh, I'm going to pay for you guys to do that. Anybody who wants to do this can go. So you can imagine 70 years after they have been carried off into exile, not everybody would relocate at that point. You have made a life. You have found work. You have done whatever. You have established yourself in Babylon. Most people stayed. But the most pious among them, the most fervently interested in reestablishing everything that the law of Moses said was supposed to happen, the feasts that were meant to take place every year, and the temple where the sacrifices could be offered, this had not happened for 70 years. And the most intensely interested in restoring worship to Yahweh returned from exile to rebuild. And that is where we pick up the story here in chapter 4 of Ezra. And chapter 3 of Ezra talks about how they arrive and how they rebuild the altar and for the first time in 70 years offer sacrifices in accordance with the law of Moses. And it's a great celebration. And they celebrate the Feast of Booths, which happened at the end of the harvest, and it's a way of wrapping everything up and thanking God at the end of the harvest. There was also another feast that happened at the beginning of harvest. So they celebrate the Feast of Booths, and after that, they begin work on the temple, and they lay the foundation, and they throw a big party and a great celebration, and there's worship and praise, and everyone's excited that they're going to rebuild the temple. And the joy and the celebration is mingled with the crying and weeping of the oldest among them who actually remembered the Temple of Solomon and are looking now on just a bare foundation. But it's a moment of great celebration, and that's where we pick up in chapter 4. The enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the exile were building a temple to Yahweh, God of Israel. And they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we seek your God just as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." We have in this first verse laid out what's going to happen over the next 100 years. And there are two parties involved. There are the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin was the tribe immediately north of Judah. So a lot of the people of Benjamin and Judah were kind of mixed together in all of this. So there's the enemies, And then there's the children of the exile, those who have come out of the exile and returned to rebuild. And these are clearly two groups in opposition to each other. That's the way the story is framed from the very first verse. I will suggest, though, as we continue reading, if we read in verse 2, their initial approach isn't the approach of an enemy. They actually want to help. They say in verse 2, let us help you build. And they talk about their God and wanting to honor their God and displaying an interest in what they are trying to do here. So initially, I don't think that they approached as enemies, although I think in retrospect, as the story is being written after it's all said and done, they clearly do become enemies. So I think that's why we have this designation of them up front as enemies. Even though their original approach is not hostile. Their original approach is we want to help. We want to be a part of it. Now they approach Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the guy the Persians installed as governor. He was a descendant of David, so there was great hope among the returned Jews that the throne of David would be reestablished, and the covenant of God with David of having a dynasty that would rule forever, that would be restored through Zerubbabel. And he's mentioned in the following verses. The high priest that returned and became high priest as they were rebuilding was Yeshua or Joshua. And so we have these two primary leaders in the return from the exile. So these people from the north, from the tribes of the north, that area, they approach Zerubbabel, the heads of the fathers' houses, the chiefs of the different clans, and they ask for permission to help build with them. Now notice they approach them with humility and deference, and they even say, we seek your God, rather than saying our God. They understand that their knowledge of Yahweh and their approach is derivative, it's tangential, it comes through the Jewish people. And the people of Judah they recognize as having a more legitimate claim to this worship than they do. But they say, we seek your God just the way you do. And they say, we've been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria. Now, this is 2 empires back. The Babylonians came after the Assyrians, and then the Persians are now in charge. But this indicates that these people who live in the north still identify themselves not as Israelites, but as people who were deported from other far nations and brought here by Esarhaddon of Assyria. Even though once they arrived there, they have mingled with the Israelites who were still there, the Israelite part of their blood is a minority part. And we read in 2 Kings 17 what happens when these people come, and each of them brings their own deity from wherever they were. They bring their own gods to worship, and they're setting up their life there and starting to do things. And lions begin to attack people, and they interpret that to mean that God is not pleased with them. So they reach out to the Assyrians, and they say, listen, we don't know how to worship the God of this land. And the Assyrians find a priest in the exile and bring him back to Israel. And this priest comes and sets up shop in Bethel. Now, if you have a good memory, you might remember that when I preached about Jeroboam, when the kingdom divided, and Jeroboam was the first king of the northern tribes, he established in Bethel a center of worship, and to draw people there, he put a golden young bull in that temple. Even though the law of Moses strictly forbade the worship of any kind of images representing Yahweh or anybody else, he knew that this is something people would really like. So the guy who's returning from exile to teach them how to worship Yahweh, he didn't even know how to do it right. That's why the exile happened. They were already mixing the worship of Yahweh with the worship of all these other gods, and having a very pagan and a very non-Mosaic approach to worshiping Yahweh. But that's the guy who comes to train them in how to worship Yahweh. And we're told in 2 Kings 17 that they started worshiping Yahweh, but they didn't stop worshiping all their other gods. So Yahweh became the local deity, but they still worshiped all the other gods they were worshiping. So when they come and say, we've been worshiping Yahweh, we've been worshiping your God, way back for 200 years now we've been doing this. We have a long history of honoring Yahweh. We want to be a part of this. You can imagine how the returned exiles perceived this, right? Because they understood during the exile, they're listening to prophets like Jeremiah. They're reading and listening to the prophecies of people like Ezekiel. And these guys make it very clear that the reason the exile happened is that the people had corrupted their worship of Yahweh, and it was no longer what God had asked them to do. They had come up with their own version and their own thing, and it wasn't what God wanted. And because of that, God did not protect them from the Babylonians, and the exile happened. So the people who are returning from exile have been reading these prophets, and they come back with a clear determination. We're never again going to fall into that trap. We're never again going to worship other gods. We're not going to mix anything in with what God has given us in the law of Moses. We are going to be pure in our approach to worship. So they arrive and start building, and all of a sudden these guys from the north show up and say, we've been worshiping Yahweh just like you. Let us be a part of this. Well, you can see the danger that immediately there's the threat of starting to mix the worship of Yahweh with this corrupted syncretic approach that's going on in the north. Syncretism, right? Where you take all these different things and just merge them together into this kind of weird mishmash of religious approaches. So this is a very real danger to the project that they're undertaking. It's a real threat. And let's be honest, the people of God have faced these kinds of threats from the beginning. I grew up in Spain, and my earliest childhood was lived under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco in Spain. And when he won, when there was this civil war and he came out on top and he established the dictatorship, one thing he did was he appealed to the Roman Catholic Church in Spain and said, guys, help me rule. And I will serve your interests, and we will establish a moral nation that is following the principles of the church. And the Roman Catholic Church in Spain was all too happy to marry into this relationship with Franco. To the point that during the dictatorship, and we experienced this in the early years, my parents were in Spain trying to plant churches in the 70s. Opposition to an evangelical church, a non-Roman Catholic church, was severe. It was very difficult because the Roman Catholic Church was able to institute policy. They were able to form the moral fabric of the laws and everything. In fact, at that time, the priest in a local village would have as much power as the head of the Guardia Civil, the local police, the thugs that kept everybody in line. You can imagine when Franco died and what followed in Spain was a liberal democracy. You can imagine that quickly people lost all interest in the Roman Catholic Church. And they had no interest in that version of Christ that takes power and uses it. I'm told by people who have arrived here recently from Venezuela that that's happening in Venezuela, that the powers that be are approaching churches and saying, let us help you, and let's partner, let's do things together. And I think the church rightly should perceive these approaches as dangerous. that we should be wary of marrying ourselves as followers of Christ to any government, to any dictator, to any political party. We don't sell ourselves out to any of these because we have a different allegiance. That's the threat they're facing right here. Syncretism has arrived at their door. What are they going to do? Verse 3. But Zerubbabel and Yeshua and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. We together will build for Yahweh, God of Israel, just as King Cyrus, king of Persia, commanded us." So the response of all the leadership in the returned exiles is to tell them, no, you may not participate with us in what we're doing here. And if you're familiar with the idea of honor-shame cultures, and this was an honor-shame culture, the Middle East, to this day, that's very much the way the Middle Eastern culture is. And one of the most important things in these kinds of cultures is allowing people to save face. Now, culturally, if you have a request and you want to respond with no, the way you do it, you have to figure out a way to say no without embarrassing the person asking. That's not the approach they take. They don't try to soften the blow. They don't try to help them save face. They basically say, "You guys, how dare you? You guys have nothing to do with us. You are less than worthless. You have nothing to contribute, and we want nothing to do with you." Now, understanding their perception of what led to the exile in the first place, we can see where they're coming from. But think for a moment how the northern people received this, that they were publicly humiliated. And to make things worse, under the Persian Empire, the local seat for that whole region was in Samaria. The local governing authority for that whole area that they called the region beyond the river was in Samaria. So these guys are in a position to do them some harm. So this harsh response, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house." And they accept that, yes, it's our God, not your God. Our God, we'll build it. And it says, "we together." So they use this language of inclusion and community and partnership, but in a very harsh way to say, "We together without you. We, as a group in unity, will accomplish this, but we don't want you to be any part of this. You have nothing in common with us." Now, here's the hard thing about this. The northern tribes had a point. You know, one of the themes that runs through the prophets in this period is the theme of God restoring the northern tribes, of God restoring the scattered Israelite tribes of the north and bringing them back. Jeremiah has this beautiful image of Rachel, who was the mother of the two largest tribes in the northern territory, Ephraim and Manasseh. Rachel, the mother of Joseph, Joseph and Benjamin, those were the grandchildren. But Rachel weeping, looking to the north after the Assyrians have taken everybody off into exile, and weeping for her children who are no more. And Jeremiah speaks a vision of God bringing those children back and God restoring them. So this idea of the northern people being brought back to Yahweh was in the prophets. It's clear that God has made his divine intent known through the prophets, that he intends to restore the separated northern people. And their claim to be worshiping Yahweh has some merit. They're not pure Israelites, but they certainly have Israelite blood in their mix. And they have been worshiping Yahweh, not the right way, but they have been worshiping Yahweh these 200 years. But they are given no possibility of inclusion, no pathway to partnership. They are completely rebuffed. Let's keep reading, verse 4. Then the people in the land discouraged the hands of the people of Judah and deterred them from building. There's a notorious chronological issue in chapter 4 of Ezra, because we have in chapter 4 of Ezra a review of this opposition to the reconstruction project, and the review goes all the way to the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is about 100 years later than the initial return. But through that whole period, and they talk about different kings, through that whole period, there's concerted opposition from the north to everything they're trying to do in the south. Now, the way Ezra 4 is written, it reads like the end result is under Artaxerxes, that last one there. They send a letter, and the result is that the king sends back a command that they stop building, and that's when they stop building the temple. But actually, by the time we get to Artaxerxes, the temple's already been finished. It was finished back during Darius. So what do we make of that? Well, what's going on here is the writer has outlined this whole century of opposition, start to beginning. And so when under Artaxerxes they're told to stop building, it's not the temple they're told to stop building, it's the wall, the reconstruction of the city, those things that are going on that have to be halted. So there's a bit of, it's kind of all mishmashed together. It kind of reads like it takes over 100 years to rebuild the temple, but it didn't. They did finish it during Darius the First's reign. But this is the pattern. How do they respond to this insult? They say, oh, okay, we're not good enough for you. Well, we're going to do everything we can to keep you from doing what you're trying to do. And they spend the next 100 years doing everything they can, spending money, using their political influence and their ability to influence policy in their communications with Babylon. They go to great lengths to do everything they can to keep the people of Judah from rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. They're hurt and they're angry, and they do all they can to stop it. Let's keep reading verse 5. And they bribed counselors to work against them, to foil their plan throughout the time of Cyrus, king of Persia, and even up to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now notice he stops at Darius because I think he recognizes it's during Darius that they actually finished building the temple, but they're not done. They still have to rebuild the wall. They have to rebuild the city itself. So then he continues in verse 6, and during the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against those who dwelt in Judah and Jerusalem. I'm going to stop there, but if we kept on in verse 7, we'd go on to Artaxerxes, the next king, and they'd even include the letter that they send to Artaxerxes, getting him to stop the work, and all of this. And then, of course, in chapter 5, we return back to the project of rebuilding the temple. What do we make of all this? On the one hand, there's something that they did absolutely right. They refused to compromise. They refused to twist or taint what they were doing. They refused to mix together the way God had told them to do things with the way other people had decided to do things. In that sense, they were absolutely right. And this is something that we find both in the Old and the New Testament. In the New Testament, Paul talks about this problem in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? And I'm sorry, I have the wrong chapter there. It's chapter 6, not 9. But Paul makes it very clear, we cannot join forces with people who are opposed to Christ. That makes no sense. And we find in this text a problem that the people of God have faced from the very beginning. You see, we have a calling when we come to God to holiness, a calling to purity, a calling to piety. We are meant to renounce sinful patterns of living and embrace a new way of living. So the way we do things in life is following the commandments God has given us, and we believe very strongly that we need to reflect the righteousness of God in the way we're living our lives. And the call to holiness is in both the Old and the New Covenants. It's not that when we get to Jesus, holiness is off the table. We are called to deeply surrender ourselves to God. And the core idea of holy is set apart to God, so that I don't belong to myself. I belong to God. And I exclusively belong to Him. I am His alone. I belong to nothing else. I don't give my allegiance or myself to anything else. That's a very real call. And through the history of the people of God, the difficulty in pursuing holiness has been that there's a lot of unholiness all around us. And one approach to dealing with that is to insulate yourself from the unholiness around you. You will be holy by not being touched by the people around you who do not want to be holy. And there's a long history in the people of God, and expressed in very different contexts, of withdrawing from the world around us and excluding the world around us from our sphere so that we can be holy to God. There's a problem with that, because our own holiness has to be grounded in the very holiness of God, right? God Himself is set apart. He alone exists apart from creation altogether. He alone is the only non-contingent being in existence. The whole universe could stop existing and God would still be here. He is truly set apart. And how does He exercise His holiness? Is it by isolating Himself from sinners? That's not what God did. God took on flesh and came here and walked the dirty streets of our world. And He didn't just stick to the cleanest parts of this world. He walked among lepers and prostitutes and people who had sold themselves out to the Roman Empire, sold their own people out for a buck. He went to the worst of the worst. And He did not hide from this. He put Himself in the middle of it. And here's what Jesus did. He remained holy. He remained righteous. He remained sinless. But He didn't exclude others from His presence. So if we're going to do holiness, we have to do it the way God has shown us to do it. And here's the other half of the equation. God's people have always had mission. God's people have always had purpose. It all begins when God calls Abraham and says to him, Abraham, I've got a plan. I'm going to use you, and I'm going to use your family as the means by which I am going to bring blessing to every clan on the face of the earth. When the covenant of the law is being established, God tells the people of Israel, I want you to be my nation of priests. I want all of you to become mediators of me to the whole world. That is the purpose of your election and calling. And when Jesus said His goodbye to His disciples upon His resurrection, He gave them the Great Commission. And He said, yes, you're going out there. I want you to not stop until you have reached the ends of the earth. And I want you to make disciples of every nation. There is mission and there is holiness. There is piety and purpose. And we have to have both. We cannot surrender mission in the name of piety, in the name of holiness. Ponder for a moment, how might this story have gone differently if the response when these people from the north came was to say, you really want to worship Yahweh? Listen, we recognize we did it wrong for so long. That's why the exile happened. The only way to do it is to do it right. So if you want to bring your religious experts to us, and let's sit down together and read through the covenant of Moses, and if this is what you want to do, if you're willing to partner with us in this and commit yourself to this, then come and help. How different would things have been? And they wouldn't have had to compromise anything. They could have said, this is what has to be. You have to agree to this up front if you want to be a part of what we're doing. But they could have at least offered the opportunity. Now, likely the response would have been thanks, but no thanks. We don't want to abandon all of our gods. But at the very least, might they not have saved themselves 500 years of hatred? If they had just not sacrificed mission in the name of holiness, purpose in the name of piety. We are called to be set apart to God. We are called to be holy. We cannot join the wicked in their sinful patterns of living and thinking and being in this world. But we cannot be holy in isolation. We have a mission in this life. We have a purpose. Jesus commands us to make disciples of all nations, and he tells us we are not to exclude anyone from God's message of life and restoration. We may be tempted, as these returned exiles were, to seek to please God by withdrawing from the sinners next door, by fleeing in terror from the Muslim who moves into our neighborhood and they build a mosque in our neighborhood, or the Hindu who moves next door and builds their temple somewhere close to our house. And our response to that is, I want to draw back from that. I don't want anything to do with these people. But Jesus went to Samaria. He sat by a well, and he welcomed a sinful woman into God's story. That is how we pursue God. We carry out mission the way Jesus did. We don't allow mission to focus so much on the physical needs that we leave God out of the equation. We don't reduce mission to humanism. But we also share Christ and Him crucified, the true message of a life surrendered to redemption in God's hands. Holiness and mission, piety and purpose, we hold hand in hand. We recognize that we cannot let them ever be set against each other. I don't know where you find yourself this morning. Some of you might not understand much of what I'm talking about because you haven't even begun to walk with God. If that's you this morning, let me tell you, God wants to make you a part of His eternal story. He doesn't care where you're coming from. He doesn't care what your background is, how religious or irreligious you are. He wants you to be a part of it, and He will welcome you if you'll just come and say, God, take my life. Jesus, I want to surrender my life to whatever it is you want to do. If that's you this morning, I want to challenge you to make that step and to surrender yourself to Him. And maybe you already are walking with Christ, and today has been a reminder. We struggle with these two ends, mission and holiness. And maybe today's been a reminder that you have been negligent in one or both of these extremes. And you need to repent and tell God, God, I want to be on the same page with you. I want to embrace what you're calling me to. Whatever it is God's put on your heart, this is our time to respond to Him. We're going to sing a song. as we're singing this song. The altar is open. Please come, kneel, and speak directly to God what's on your heart. If you need to talk to somebody, want somebody to pray with you, my wife and I will be here off to the side. You can come and we'll be happy to pray with you. Let's all stand. Please come while we sing.